In this video, you're going to learn how to use combined reducers to create Redux stores that use multiple reducers as opposed to one big one. The technique and principle is going to be exactly the same. We're just going to be introducing this new function into the mix. Now, why do we need this? Because previously we had a very simple state, so our one reducer didn't get that out of control. But look at this state. It is way more complex, and managing all of this with a single reducer is going to be a huge burden. So we're going to avoid doing that, because think of all of the actions that we need to create. We're going to have one for the ability to add an expense. We also want to be able to remove an expense, so we're going to need that too. We're going to be editing an expense, so we'll have the edit expense action, and that's just for the expenses array. We're going to have all sorts of actions for the filters array as well. For example, set text filter. We're also going to have the ability to change the sort by value, sort by date. We're going to have the ability to sort by amount. We also need the ability to change those date filters. So we have just two more for those. Set start date, and right here, set end date. So setting up all of these actions and handling all of them with a single reducer is just not feasible. So what we're going to do is learn how we can break up the application into multiple reducers. Now what we're going to do is use a single reducer for each root property in our Redux store. So what do we have here? We have two big ones. We have expenses, which is an array of objects, and we have filters, which is an object with various properties on it. We're going to create two reducers, one that just handles this array as if this didn't even exist, and one that just handles this object as if this didn't even exist. We're then going to take those two reducers and combine them together to create the complete store. Now that's a bit abstract right now, so we're going to go through the process of actually creating a store that has two reducers associated with it. What I'm going to do is create a reducer for the expenses array. So right here, we can create a section for that, expenses reducer, and I can create a variable for the reducer function. That's a const expenses reducer, and we will set this equal to a function, and this is going to be our reducer function. So we got to set it up correctly. We take in those two arguments, the state and the action, and we return what? The new state. We're not going to worry about filling this in just yet. For the moment, let's set up the default state value. So for this thing, what's the default? Well, it's just an empty array. There is no default expense that we're going to have in place. What we're going to do is just start off with none, and that's perfectly fine. Now we can define our default values right in line, and for an empty array, that's appropriate because sitting right here, we have a very small amount of code. But imagine we have a more complex state like the reducer that's going to manage this object. We want to set up a good set of defaults. Text should be an empty string. Sort by should be either date or amount. We also want to start date and end date as undefined. And adding all of that into the arguments list is going to get a little nasty. So we can just create a variable for our default value and reference the variable here instead. Up above, I can do just that by making a new const and calling this something like expenses reducer default state. I can then set this equal to the default state. In this case, it's an empty array, and I can reference that here instead. Perfect. Now down below, we can set up our switch statement. So I'm going to have switch right here. I'm going to switch off of the action type value, and there are going to be a few different cases that we're going to eventually handle, but for now we can just set up the default case, which is to return the current state. So all we do is return state. Now this reducer is set up in its most basic sense, and we can go ahead and actually wire this up. Down below, we're going to create a new store. So I'll leave a comment for store creation. And right here, what I'm going to do is just create a new store like we did before. So const store equals, and we're still going to be using the create store function. Now, like we did previously, for just a few moments, we're going to be passing in the expenses reducer directly to create store, ignoring combined reducers altogether. Now, if we go ahead and actually take a look at what the default state is, we'll be able to make sure our reducer is working. Right here, we can go ahead and print that to the screen. Console.log store dot get state. So we're going to be calling getState, and it's not reactive. We're not putting it in subscribe, so it's going to fire just a single time. And if I do save this file over here, we should get the default state. And what is the default state for our store? It is an empty array. Now this is great because it proves our reducer is working, but this is not what we want in the end of the day. We want that array to live on the expenses property. So how exactly do we set that up? Well, to set that up, we just need to make a little change to our call to create store, introducing the combine reducers function as well. So as the name suggests, combine reducers lets you combine multiple reducers to create a single store. That allows us to break up our application into multiple smaller reducers as opposed to one gigantic out of control one. Now using it is pretty simple. Right here, as the first argument to create store, we call combine reducers, and we call it as a function. Now this is exactly the same as breaking it out onto its own line, and that's exactly what I'm going to do just to make things a little easier to read. Now combine reducers also takes an argument. This is an object, and on this object we're going to provide those key value pairs. The key is going to be the root state name, and the value is going to be the reducer that's supposed to manage that. So in our case, we have expenses and filters at the root. Right here, I'm going to set up expenses. I'm going to set it up to be managed by the expenses reducer. Now, when I do this, we're going to see a pretty notable change to the default state for our store. Now, the Redux store is an object with a property expenses, and that is where the array lives. The array currently has 0 items, but that's okay. The goal was to get that array moved off of the actual store itself and into a property, in this case, expenses on the root object. Now, why exactly is this working? Well, previously we just took expenses reducer and we passed that directly into create store. Create store called our reducer. It calls the reducer once right away with no state and no action. So the end result was the default state getting set, and then there was no action type. So what happened? We had the state returned, and our empty array became the Redux store value. We're doing the same thing now. We're just saying instead of putting the array on the root, why don't we create an object like this and put the array on the expenses property? This is going to allow us to build more complex Redux stores, and that's actually what we're going to start doing right now. We're going to create a second reducer and we're going to register it just like we registered this one. So if I wanted to add something else on here, I would have some other value, and I would set some other value equal to some sort of reducer function for that, some reducer. And I could add on as many as I wanted to this object. And that's not the one we're actually going to be adding. What we're going to be adding up next is the filters reducer. So the filters reducer is going to be responsible for managing all of this stuff right here. We're going to set it on the filters property. The default state is going to be this object, and we'll talk about the actual default values we're going to be using right now, because registering and building out the basic filters reducer is actually going to be your challenge for the video. So you're going to have to create those 2 variables for this new reducer. You're going to want to set them up correctly, and you can use the exact same simple switch statement. Then down below, you're going to want to register it to combine reducers. So what are the default state values we want? First up, we're going to go ahead and have text set equal to an empty string. So text will be an empty string. Then we're going to go ahead and have sort by starting off at date. Next up, we're going to have start date, and that is going to start off at undefined as well as end date. End date will also start off at undefined. So you're going to be setting up the default state object. You're going to be configuring that inside of the new reducer you create. Then you're going to go ahead and register it on combine reducers. And what should be the end result? The end result is that alongside of expenses inside of this object, we should see another property called filters. And the filters property should be an object itself. And that object should have all of these values: text, sort by, start date, and end date all set up. Don't worry about dispatching actions just yet. The goal for the moment is to just create those 2 variables, register the reducer down below, and check your work in the terminal. Take some time to knock this one out, and when you're done, click play. How'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get that done. What I'm going to start off with is creating the default state variable. Const filters reducer default state. I'm going to set this equal to an object, which is what the state will be for filters. We saw that down below. And I'm going to set up the 4 values appropriately. So text is going to start off as an empty string showing all all expenses. Sort by is going to sort them by date by default, but we can always change that via the user interface. And the same thing is true with start date and end date. They can be changed via the UI, but we'll start them both off at undefined. Start date undefined, end date undefined. Excellent. Now that we have the default state object in place, we can actually create the reducer, and that's going to happen right here. I'll make another variable for that. Const filters reducer equals, right here we need our state, and we want to start that state off with the value from filters reducer default state. Next up, we also need to name action. There is no default for that. If it's provided, great. If not, that's great too. Now we have the filters reducer function in place, and I mentioned that we're just going to have the exact same switch statement inside. You could have typed it out, or you could have just copy and pasted it in. Now that we have the filters reducer function in place, we can actually register it on combine reducers. So down below, we're going to do just that. What's the root property we want to create? It's called filters. And which reducer do we want to manage filters? And that is the filters reducer. And there we go. With that in place, we are all done. And if we save our work, we should be able to see the correct default state. Now right here, I do have an error. Filters reducer default state is not defined. It looks like my fat fingers got a capital E right there. I can just go ahead and fix that. Save the program and it should refresh. Perfect. So we have our object in place. We have the expenses empty array, which we had before, but now we also have the filters object. And if we crack that open, we have all of our default values right here. We have end date and start date, which are both correctly set to undefined. We have sort by, which is indeed the string date. And finally, we have the text search, and that starts off as an empty string showing all expenses by default. And there we have it. We now have the correct Redux store in place. We have multiple reducers. We have all of our defaults showing up correctly. I'm going to go ahead and remove the comment right here that outlined the default values. And that is it for this video. So let's take a quick moment to recap. Previously, we passed reducer functions directly into create store. That allowed us to just have one reducer that maintains the entire state, and that gets messy really quickly. So what we're going to do instead is use combine reducers. We call combine reducers, passing the return value into create store, and on this object, we define what we want our Redux store to look like. So instead of being just an array, we now have an object, and we have 2 properties, expenses and filters, which is exactly what we saw below in our demo state. Now, the expenses property is managed by the expenses reducer, and the filters property is managed by the filters reducer. Now, at this point, we know how to set up the basic store, but we don't know how to dispatch things like actions correctly. How do we have expense reducer respond to a specific action, and how do we have the filters reducer respond to another action? We're going to go ahead and learn all about that in the next one as we continue building out our Redux store. I'm real excited to get to that, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.